Hello. Today, we're going to sit together in a very quiet space, no hurry. No noise. Just you and the slow movement of your own thoughts. There is a question that looks simple on the surface, yet reaches deeply into the way we live every single day. Why do most people never truly think for themselves? This question isn't meant for the crowd. It is for those who, at some point in life, have felt something quietly unsettling, moments when you do things without knowing why. Moments when you make choices but cannot tell whether they are truly yours or just the patterns borrowed from people around you. If you observe how people live, you'll notice something interesting. Most are very busy. But not busy thinking, they are busy reacting. Busy chasing what must be done. Busy handling whatever appears in front of them. Busy keeping up so they don't fall behind. But being busy is not the same as thinking. Being busy often just means running on habit, on inertia, on an internal autopilot shaped by the society we grew up in. From childhood, we learn to follow instructions, to obey rules, to go through the correct steps. None of this is wrong. But when everyone follows the same template, we slowly lose the most important ability, the ability to look inward and decide from our own perspective. When you grow up in an environment where rewards go to those who follow rules, and punishment falls on those who deviate, you naturally develop a reflex. Safety belongs to the crowd, and risk belongs to the one who stands alone. People don't fail to think for themselves because they lack intelligence. They fail because the brain is always trying to conserve energy. Independent thinking requires alertness, pausing, self-questioning. It drains energy. It slows you down when the world is speeding up. It sometimes makes you feel out of place. So the brain chooses the easier path, using other people's opinions as your own. Using the crowd's direction as your direction. Using ready-made solutions instead of digging to the root of a problem. And over time, without noticing, we lose the habit of thinking for ourselves. Some people avoid thinking differently because they fear responsibility. When you think for yourself, you must accept the consequences. If you're wrong, you are the one who is wrong. But if you simply follow others and it goes badly, the blame doesn't belong to you. It belongs to circumstances. To what people told me. To everyone was doing it. That's why living without independent thought feels safe, even though beneath that safety is an invisible cage. Thinking for yourself doesn't mean fighting society or forcing yourself to be different. It simply means stopping for a moment and asking, is this truly right for me? Yet most people never ask that question. They choose a profession because others say it's stable. They choose a job because others say it's good. They hold beliefs from childhood to adulthood without ever checking whether those beliefs are still true. And they call that living. But in reality, it is living a second-hand life. The deeper reason many people don't think for themselves is this: silence is frightening. When you begin to think on your own, you must face a gap. The gap between what you once believed and what you are just beginning to see. That gap is uncomfortable. When you pause and think, your whole life becomes clearer, but also more exposed. You see that some things you chased were not truly yours. You see that choices you believed were correct were merely safe. You see that truth is not always pleasant. Some avoid thinking because they fear change. Independent thinking means you may need to change your life if you discover it's misaligned. And change is hard. It demands leaving what is familiar and stepping into the uncertain. In a world that worships safety, change becomes more frightening than living a life that never belonged to you. You can observe this clearly in major decisions: choosing a career, choosing a partner, choosing how to use money, choosing life goals. Many people choose based on what others label as good. But good, for someone else, is not necessarily right for you. If you never ask yourself what you truly want, you will spend your entire life following a rhythm you didn't create. When you pay attention, you'll see that most people's choices come not from thinking but from imitation. They copy how others earn money, how others live, how others define success. But imitation only works if you understand the principle behind it. If you copy only the surface, you live a borrowed life. Thinking for yourself begins when you dare to look at yourself without excuses. When you dare to admit that sometimes you choose what's easy instead of what's right. When you dare to acknowledge that some beliefs you hold were never examined, they were inherited. And when you dare to do the hardest thing, question what you were once certain about. One of the biggest reasons people don't think independently is because they confuse information with thought. Having more information doesn't mean you are thinking. Reading many books doesn't mean you understand deeply. In today's age of information overload, people consume endlessly but process very little. They collect data but fail to connect it. They listen, watch, read, but don't apply. The result? A mind full of information but a life empty of insight. Eventually, you will realize something gentle but powerful. True thinking comes not from adding more, but from subtracting. Subtracting noise, subtracting rush, subtracting the weight of what others impose on you. When the outside becomes quiet, the inside becomes clear. And when you stop long enough, you begin to hear your own voice, the voice buried beneath the world's noise. Once you hear it, your life becomes clearer, not easier, but truer. You begin to see what truly belongs to you and what is merely a performance borrowed from others. Today, all you need is one small step. Question a belief you've always taken for granted. You don't need to change anything yet, just ask. Every awakening begins with a single question. And that question is the beginning of seeing your entire life with new eyes. As we continue this reflection, I want you to stay with the same quiet pace, the kind of pace that lets your thoughts settle instead of rushing past you. Independent thinking grows in silence, not in noise, and the moment you begin to slow down, things that once looked ordinary suddenly reveal layers you didn't notice before. One of the reasons most people don't think for themselves is because they live in a constant state of mental occupation. Not deep thought, just occupation. Their minds are always filled with tasks, notifications, deadlines, expectations. When the mind is overloaded, it doesn't think, it just reacts. And a mind that reacts cannot notice the deeper truth beneath everyday life. Most people have never been taught how to think. They've only been taught what to think. From school to work, the emphasis is always on correct answers, not original questions, on staying aligned, not looking deeper, on finishing the task, not understanding the principle. And so the ability to think independently slowly fades, like a muscle that is never used. True thinking begins with questioning, but questioning itself has become uncomfortable. When you question something, you step outside the script. You interrupt the flow. You break the rhythm that everyone else is following. And because humans are social creatures, stepping outside the group feels dangerous, even when the group is heading in the wrong direction. Another reason most people never think for themselves is emotional convenience. Thinking clearly often forces you to confront things you would rather avoid, your fears, your contradictions, your hidden motivations. It reveals areas where your life is misaligned. It uncovers truths you might not be ready to accept. So the mind chooses comfort over clarity, illusion over truth, familiarity over change. And yet, clarity has its own quiet power. When you begin to think for yourself, even in small moments, you start to see how many layers of borrowed beliefs you've been carrying. Beliefs inherited from parents, teachers, friends, society. Beliefs you never examined. Beliefs that shaped your choices more than your own voice ever did. Independent thinking is not about being different. It is about being honest. Honest enough to see when you are repeating ideas you never understood. Honest enough to admit when a belief no longer serves you. Honest enough to notice when you are living someone else's version of a good life. The truth is this: most people fear clarity because clarity demands change. And change demands courage. You can see this in the smallest behaviors. Many people repeat opinions they've heard simply because forming their own is too much effort. They defend ideas they've never questioned because questioning would threaten the identity they've built around those ideas. They follow the crowd because standing alone feels unsafe. But identity built on borrowed beliefs is fragile. The moment life changes, it cracks. And when it cracks, people panic, because they never built a stable foundation inside themselves. Thinking for yourself begins when you stop running from this fragility. When you are willing to look at your life without filters, not with harshness, but with sincerity. When you stop asking, "What should I think?" and begin asking, "What is actually true for me?" This shift is subtle but powerful. You don't need to change your entire life overnight. You only need to start noticing. What thoughts are truly yours? What choices come from your inner voice? And what choices come from the expectations of others? Where have you been following without realizing? These questions are not meant to judge. They are meant to awaken. And awakening begins with awareness, awareness of the invisible influences shaping your life. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Once you notice the patterns, you cannot ignore them. Once you begin thinking for yourself, the world becomes clearer, but also more honest. And honesty, though uncomfortable, is the first doorway to freedom. This is where your journey continues, not by trying to change everything, but by learning to see everything more clearly. When you are ready, we will take the next step together. As your awareness sharpens, something subtle begins to happen. You start noticing the forces that shape your thoughts long before you ever make a choice. Most people assume they think freely, but much of human thinking is shaped by invisible influences, culture, family, habits, fears, and the silent pressure to belong. When you look closer, you realize how little of your inner world actually comes from you. One major reason people don't think for themselves is the invisible dependence on external validation. Many people don't form opinions based on truth. They form opinions based on acceptance. They believe what is socially rewarded, not what is internally honest. And because approval feels pleasant, the mind becomes addicted to it. This dependence quietly replaces independent thought with socially reinforced thought. You can see this everywhere. In conversations where people repeat popular views rather than authentic ones. In workplaces where people stay silent because speaking up risks disapproval. In social media where people shape their thoughts to match the mood of the crowd. When the desire to belong becomes stronger than the desire to understand, independent thinking fades. Another influence that blocks original thought is fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being judged. Fear of looking foolish. The mind tries to protect itself by avoiding uncertainty. But uncertainty is exactly where real thinking begins. Most people don't think for themselves because they don't allow themselves to enter the uncomfortable space of not knowing. They prefer the illusion of clarity over the work of discovering clarity. But genuine thinking requires being okay with confusion. It requires admitting, "I'm not sure," and letting that uncertainty lead you deeper rather than scare you away. It requires the humility to unlearn, the patience to observe, and the courage to stand alone until your understanding becomes clear. Another quiet barrier to independent thought is mental noise. Modern life constantly fills the mind with stimulation, music, reels, opinions, news, notifications, endless chatter. Silence becomes rare, but without silence, the mind cannot think, it can only react. Many people mistake constant mental activity for thinking. But true thinking is not activity, it is clarity. And clarity grows only in stillness. You might notice this when you step away from noise, during a quiet walk, a slow morning, or a moment away from your phone. Suddenly, thoughts feel cleaner. You start to see patterns you missed before. You feel the difference between thoughts that are truly yours and thoughts that were installed by repetition. This is the beginning of mental independence. Another important point. People don't think for themselves because they underestimate the power of their own mind. They assume others know better, experts, leaders, influencers, the majority, but no one sees your life from the inside the way you do. No one carries your experiences, your intuition, your inner compass. When you outsource your thinking to others, you outsource your life. Independent thinking doesn't mean rejecting everything outside of you. It means filtering everything through your own understanding. You can learn from others, but you don't surrender your judgment to them. You can listen, but you don't obey blindly. You can consider opinions, but you decide from your own clarity. And here's something important. Independent thinking is not loud. It is quiet. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't try to convince others. It doesn't force itself onto the world. True independent thinking is gentle but firm. It is the quiet voice inside that says, "This is what feels true to me," even when the world is moving in another direction. Once you begin to think for yourself, your relationship with life changes. Decisions become lighter, because they come from your core, not from social pressure. You stop seeking permission. You stop fearing disapproval. You become less reactive and more intentional. Life stops feeling like a script you're following and becomes a direction you're choosing. And the most surprising part? When you think for yourself, the world becomes simpler, not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes yours. You're no longer pulled in 10 different directions. You no longer chase what others chase. You begin to see clearly what matters and what doesn't. And that clarity becomes a strength the world cannot shake. This is the quiet transformation that happens long before any visible change appears on the outside. And as you move forward, this shift will continue to deepen, not through force, but through awareness. When you're ready, we will continue our final part together. As your thinking becomes clearer, you begin to notice the final and most powerful shift. The moment you stop thinking from fear and start thinking from clarity. Most people never reach this stage, because clarity requires a quiet kind of courage, the courage to trust your own mind. When you start thinking for yourself, something subtle but profound changes inside you. You no longer rush into decisions out of anxiety. You no longer chase paths simply because others say they are safe. You no longer hold on to beliefs just because they are familiar. Instead, you begin to ask a question that only a few people learn to ask sincerely. What is genuinely true for me? This question is simple, but transformative. It dissolves expectations that were never yours. It removes layers of noise that have covered your intuition for years. It brings you back to a grounded state where your mind becomes your own again. People often misunderstand independent thinking as rebellion, but in reality, it is an act of alignment. It is the process of bringing your thoughts closer to your truth, your direction, your inner compass. And when your thinking aligns with your inner truth, the rest of your life begins to adjust with it, slowly at first, then unmistakably. One of the most unexpected effects of thinking for yourself is how your relationship with uncertainty transforms. Most people fear uncertainty because they rely on others for answers. But when you develop your own way of seeing, uncertainty stops being a threat, it becomes space. A space you can explore. A space where creativity grows. A space where wisdom appears. You realize that not knowing is not weakness, it is the beginning of awareness. When you think independently, you also become more compassionate. You stop assuming everyone must think like you. You stop judging quickly. You see how many people live trapped inside beliefs they never examined, fears they never named, and choices they never truly made. Independent thinking does not create arrogance. It creates understanding, because once you've seen your own illusions, you recognize the illusions of others. As your thinking deepens, the world outside becomes louder, but the world inside becomes quieter. You stop needing the approval that once dictated your choices. You stop chasing validation that once felt essential. Now, you carry your own clarity. And that clarity becomes a form of quiet strength. Not loud, not forceful, but steady, like a light that doesn't flicker even when the room grows dark. Eventually, something beautiful happens. Your life starts to take a shape that finally feels like you. You make decisions based on your inner logic, not borrowed expectations. You choose your work differently. You spend money differently. You love differently. You walk differently. You speak differently. You begin to live a life designed from the inside out, instead of from the outside in. And this transformation is not dramatic. It is gentle. It is the kind of shift that others only notice after years. Your calmness, your stability, your direction, your freedom. The truth is, independent thinking doesn't make life easier, it makes life yours. And that simple difference changes everything. Before you close this chapter, there is one last truth worth remembering. Thinking for yourself is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily practice of observing, questioning, refining, and returning to what feels real. Some days you will be clear. Other days you will feel lost again. That is normal. Independent thinking is not about being perfect, it is about being awake. And if you stay awake long enough, you eventually see what most people never see. Life becomes lighter when your thoughts belong to you. Decisions become cleaner. Paths become visible. You stop feeling pulled by the world and start feeling guided by something deeper inside you. So tonight, before you rest, ask yourself just one quiet question, not rushed, not forced, just honest. If I stopped thinking the way the world taught me, what would I truly see? Let the answer come in its own time. This is where independent thinking begins, and where a new kind of freedom slowly unfolds.